Здравствуйте, меня зовут Никита Зеленский. Я, в общем, веду беседы в русской школе со старшими. Это школа при Яна Предтечи, храм Яна Предтечи. И мы эти беседы ведем по-английски, так что просто иногда не хватает слов по-русски, а иногда мы просто срываемся с английского на русский. Так что будем записывать эту беседу. Это будет не беседа, а просто запись по-английски, потому что слайды все по-английски. I studied physics and math, and I work with measuring the sea surface using satellite altimetry. And to do that, you have to know where the center of Earth is to apply physical laws to understand how the sea surface of the ocean moves. We have to understand the center of the Earth around which the satellites fly. This is called satellite altimetry. And they're measured using radar pulses, where the radar pulse from the satellite is reflected from the ocean surface, and the time of the emission and reception is measured. And so you have a very, very accurate knowledge of the time it takes the pulse to leave the satellite and return back. But we really want to know the time, this measurement of the ocean surface to the center of the Earth. Okay, so the start. This is the introduction to the start of these besiede, which happened. We started in October, and it's a group of several people, about 4 regular young people from the ages of, let's say, 14 to 21, which attend our lectures. There are more people that show up every now and then, and we're on the 5th lecture, but this is going back to the first introduction. The theme in this introduction is knowledge, faith, and reason, and how it's viewed by the Orthodox Church. So in this introduction, we're going to try to understand what the best approach would be to ascertain how we feel and how we understand these aspects of faith, knowledge, and reason. And just to give you a background, this question of faith, knowledge, and reason has been discussed for, I'd say, thousands of years. And the faith that we presume, of course, is the Christian faith. But of course, there's the idea of faith and belief are 2 different things. So this discussion will branch into the idea of what is belief as versus faith as well. So that's a philosophical discussion, but I think that's important, and I think it's also important to the idea of faith. So I think that's the introduction that I'd like to start with. So faith, knowledge, and reason, and as it's seen through the Orthodox Church. Those are the 2 themes, because first of all, we want to understand what it means for ourselves personally, and believe it, what these terms mean. And then we'd like to see how the Orthodox Church understands it. So what we have is a slide. I'll go through slides. We have a slide of the universe, and so we have an inner universe which we explore perhaps through the Church and through aspects of philosophy, and an outer verse which we see here, and it's vast. And so the question is, how do we approach understanding such a vast universe? And so I think the best way is through asking the right questions. And so here we would have a group discussion, asking questions and maybe adding a few questions to the list I have here. So the first question would be, how do we come to know something? Really, when you think about it, what makes you believe that you know something? We live every day, and we're used to thinking that we know things. Especially, we know how to drive. We know that if we sit in this chair, it's not going to appear in China, but it's going to stay and hold us up. We know things, but how do we come to know those things? especially through our five senses, and then through other senses that we might have, right, that you might consider a sense. Then another question is, what is faith? We say faith, ili viera, very, very simply, but what does it really mean? And so we're going to explore that. What is reason? And is it a gift from God? Is it in the image of God? What is reason? And that's a big question. These are big questions that people have debated for thousands of years. And what does our church, the Orthodox Church, say about faith, reason, and knowledge? What's the church's position on that? Is there a position? And finally, what does the church say about salvation? How do our quest for this semester, how does that fit in with what the church says about salvation? And how can we approach these questions? What's the best approach? These are big questions. I don't have necessarily the right answer, but I think we can work together and to find what makes sense for us as a group. And this will be a video group in this case. What are the right questions that we can pose to address this vast issue of what is knowledge, what is faith, and what is reason? And how does the Orthodox Church look at that? So this is my introduction to the right questions, and since this is recorded, we're not in class, that we had a lot of discussion, but this is where we stopped, and we went into the next slide, which asks, what is experience? And Albert Einstein said that knowledge can only come through experience. But then the question is, what is experience? And I guess the first question is, do we believe that? Can knowledge be acquired other than through experience? But I think it might be easier to answer that question if we have a better understanding ourselves what is presumed under experience. So certainly everyone would agree that the five senses lead to experience of the world. And so we have the five senses which we've learned in school, the sense of touch, smell, vision, hearing, and taste, of course. Yeah, so these five senses lead to different disciplines in approaching the world, and also directly in understanding the world since we've been children, babies. So how about habit? How do we learn things and to believe that we learn things? And it's through habit. We learn how to drive once it's through habit that we know that we are driving well. And it's through repetition and habit that we learn how to do a lot of things. Like, for example, sitting in this chair, we know from habit that it's not going to move or, say, you suddenly appear in China. It's habit that tells us this is not going to happen. Otherwise, how would we know? So if you sort of reflect on how we know things of the world, you'll see that perhaps we come through our knowledge or through our belief in our knowledge through habit. And this actually was a very strong point in the empirical philosophers, the English philosophers like David Hume and John Locke. So habit, we just discussed habit. How about the artistic sense? I mean, since, let's say, the artist who draws things, the artist who photographs, they go through the sense of sight, usually, maybe touch if they sculpt, but what is that sense that allows them to sculpt and to draw or to photograph? Is that a sense certainly that comes through experience? And when we experience the world, we might experience through that vision of the artist, or music for that matter. The composer writes a piece, or we perform something. We have a different sense. We're in a different world, and it's not just because we hear something, but it takes us somewhere. So what is that? That's part of experience. What about mathematics? And when Pythagoras was a philosopher in ancient Greece, he discovered, his thought was that mathematics is the secret language or key to man's understanding of the universe. If you can describe things mathematically, you'll have a deep understanding of the universe as it is. And that's the unchangeable universe for the ancient Greeks. That's what gave rise to the scientific revolution, was the belief that mathematics was the secret language. So that's experience, but that's not part of the five senses. So what is it? It's experience. So something we have to explore later, what it is. Ivan suggested a very interesting experience, a very deep experience, which I didn't consider in my slides, and I just added that. And that's the liturgical experience. And Shmemin, Alexander Shmemin, a priest in the diaspora, he was in the OCA, and he actually served in the 50s, 60s, and perhaps the early 70s. But his writings are very famous, and I think very useful to read. And he said that it's an experience that surpasses all other experiences when you enter the church. And perhaps, when you do go to church, you do feel that there's something different. And that comes through all five senses, especially in the Orthodox Church. You have the incense, the icons, and the service. But you feel something special, and that's the ecumenical experience, liturgical experience. Okay. Faith, that's an experience. What does that mean, though? What is that experience? And revelation, and when you feel that you have a vision, something's been revealed to you, that's an experience. That's not part of the five senses. What is that? How does that figure in our acquirement of knowledge? Love, that's an experience, and that's something that we have knowledge about, knowledge of the heart. But that's experience as well. And can you think of any other experience? And that's the question that we discussed in the Biseda. And I think it's an important question. It's open-ended, so we're on this quest together. And the question I'd like to move to is, how much can we trust our experience of the world to give us knowledge? And how much can we see, actually, understand of this world through our experience? And what I'd like to show, if it works out, is that there was a series of experiments made in trying to understand what we see and what we perceive. These experiments were done about 20 years ago, maybe even earlier, and you'll be surprised that at the outcome of this experiment. So I'm going to run to YouTube. Perhaps you've seen this, but perhaps you haven't. And let me turn up the sound here, and if you may watch this, and just remember what you see.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla? This video is from research by...
Okay. Так вопрос остается, кто видел горилл? Who saw the gorilla? The results of this test, performed maybe 20 some years ago, was that 50% of the people who watched, who were subjects of this experiment,
This is a test of selective
saw the gorilla. Okay. And so, what does that mean? What does that mean for us? What does that mean how we should approach knowledge? How much do we trust our senses? I mean, if so, and this selective attention is what allows magicians to have a career. You know, so what do we actually perceive in the world from our senses, and from any of the senses, and how do we know what is going on or what is real? So I think we should consider all of these things, and what is the best thing we can do in this situation? And my thinking is that we should look at the history of how people approached the sense of reality that we have. And I like to look at Socrates. And I hope everyone knows who Socrates was. He was a philosopher in ancient Greece about 400 BC. And he didn't write a thing. All he did was to ask questions. And he walked around and he asked questions. And they must have had enough resources in ancient Greece to allow people to be philosophers, because that's mostly what they did, is they asked questions. But Socrates is known as to be the wisest of men. So he instructed a whole group of youth into his school or into his belief that you should question everything. Very ironically, he was executed by Athens, by the city of Athens, for corrupting the youth. They would ask questions, and the authorities were very upset about the questions they would ask, because when you start asking questions, you'll see that perhaps we really don't have the answer to a lot of things. But he did form an answer to the question. He did ask a question. It's, what did he say about true knowledge? What did Socrates... And he had an answer to this idea of true knowledge. And he said that true knowledge is knowing that I know nothing. And, you know, I think this might seem paradoxical, but what do you think he really meant by that? I mean, what does that mean to you personally? Well, first of all, I think that he must have had humility to not grasp onto certain types of beliefs about what he knew. But then I think this points to something a little deeper that was expressed by one of the people in our group very well. So what do you think that means? So let's pause there and go on to another slide which asks a slightly different question. We'll come back to what one of the Bisedniki said, what he felt was a good explanation for this question, and what Socrates was actually asking. So let's sort of go a little bit aside from Socrates and see what does the church say about salvation, knowledge, and the question is, which ones are more important? What do you think? For the church, which is more important, knowledge or salvation? That's not a trick question. I think it's an honest question, but I think everyone probably has an opinion. So let's take a look. So, then furthermore, does the church say that knowledge is important for salvation? And that, I mean, I'm pretty sure many people don't have an answer to. But the important thing is for us to question this and try to understand what we think about this. And then to understand what we think about what is knowledge and what is salvation as well. So, what does St. Paul say about knowledge and love? And you can probably read this, but I'll read this for you. I think it kind of illuminates, I think, the Church's position on knowledge. And he said, if I have the gift of prophecy, that's seeing into the future and through revelation, and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith, so he has this thing that we call faith, so as to move mountains. And if you remember, Christ said that faith can move mountains. Do you think that means literally? Perhaps, do you think St. Paul means that literally? I don't know, that's a question. But do not have love, I am nothing. So I think that reflects on the Church position about what all of these things mean other than love. Okay, let's go on. So this is sort of the last slide. I think we're going to go back to what was discussed, just some points about the discussion. But I think for this introduction, I'd like to ask everyone to try to not to release their to have a little more humility about what they really think they believe, and to ask questions. So in the last discussion, we approached, there were 3 points which I think were interesting, which I wrote down here. And the first was Nikita Zelensky's answer to Socrates' question, what is true knowledge? And that true knowledge is that I know nothing. And what Nikita answered was that to have knowledge of the human condition is what the human condition is. And that's what Socrates was saying. And that's a very good answer, I think. You feel it in your hearts that somehow it must be true. But I think we'll have to understand what the human condition is a little more clear to see what Nikita was getting at. But that's going to be the next besieda. So I think when we ask questions, there was a very interesting philosopher called Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, who lived in the 19th century. He's famous for a lot of things, but I think one thing that he said, which was very interesting, and it is that you can't simply ask questions, that asking a question involves making a moral choice. Asking a question, there's no such thing as a question which doesn't have some sort of subjective reality to it. Does that make sense? Well, there's no such thing as an objective question, that everything's enclosed within our subjective selves, and that, especially for questions, they have some sort of moral premise. And so, according to his philosophy, that makes sense, because he felt that everything is driven in man by the will to power, and morality is a disguise of this will to power. But so that's what he felt. But I think raising that point is very interesting, because if you think of how science has been used, it's people asking the wrong questions, perhaps. How do you make an atomic bomb? So it's not an objective question. So that's what I think, the way I picture Nietzsche's question. So Nietzsche's position as well. He was a very controversial and difficult philosopher to understand, I think. So when we ask the questions, I think we have to sort of reflect on where our heart is. Okay. So, and the final point was Solzhenitsyn's idea of the liturgical experience, and how that's a separate experience from all the rest. So I think this is where we'll end our besieda. I'm sorry you can't respond, but this is the gist of what we covered in that first session. So thank you, спасибо за ваше внимание, и ну пока.